have some amazing special guests here, and all of us are going to introduce ourselves. But I want to just give you a little bit of the history. This all started out from a call, a community policing call, right? That Black SNIO hosted last summer after the incidents in the summer, particularly with the death of George Floyd, where Black IO psychologists were coming together and asking, how can we stop being spectators and become a part of the change that grew into what is now the Law Enforcement Task Force. We have a new website already for you. We'll drop that website in the chat. You will also be, we'll have some polls for you to respond to today just to keep you engaged, and also make sure that you're part of the conversation. We want to see and hear your responses and include them in the discussion as we can. And let's just start off by doing introductions. My name is Kiana Beckles, by the way. My company is Leverage Assessments. I am the chair of the Law Enforcement Task Force. And I got here because what we're seeing in today's world is that it's not that racism is not a new thing. Those of us who are Black in America are very familiar with these experiences, but with the addition of video and body cams, we are now sharing those experiences with the world. And I think that the entire world wants to know how they can all be a part of the change. And so I appreciate those of you who have come to join us to brainstorm with us about how you can be a part of that change. I think that Black industrial organizational psychologists can provide a unique perspective. So I'm inviting all of you who are Black IOs on the call to, we need you to get into this police reform space because our voices are needed. Would anyone else like to introduce themselves? Ricia, would you like to go?
Thank you so much, Kiana. I was one of those students who came to the United States from India. My grandfather was in the police. I was a PhD student when the Rodney King beatings happened. I thought at that time IO psychology would be involved more in community policing, but somehow we lost our way. And so here again, I hope that this new wave will continue and we will be all part of a change. I myself am an educator in leadership development, and I would like to see how this can help our journey. So I would like to hand it over to our special guest, not on the program, Craig.
Good morning. My name is Craig Miles. I am a career law enforcement officer, having worked in local law enforcement in the Richmond, Virginia area for just over 9 years, and for the federal government for just over 17 years. I'm also an adjunct professor at George Mason University. I'm currently teaching the graduate level ethics class, and I was invited to join a group of IO psychologists to provide a law enforcement perspective and a perspective of an African American to the ongoing subjects of racism and policing in the country. And I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks for joining us.
Joel?
Hi. Hi, my name is Joel Wiesen. I'm honored to be on this Black IO psychologist panel. I'm not Black, but the Black and Jewish experiences have some parallels. My close family and ancestors have suffered discrimination, including by the best and brightest psychologists. A century ago, the Jews of Eastern Europe were seen as mentally inferior, with an overrepresentation of petty criminals. And well before Hitler, in much of Europe, Jews were forbidden to own property, forbidden from professions. In Poland, Jewish bakeries were even forbidden to bake bread. And therefore we have bagels that are boiled first. I've spent much of the last 30 to 40 years developing professionally sound ways to reduce adverse impact in hiring of police officers, with some success in hiring a better and more diverse workforce. And I welcome inquiries and conversations about this topic. Feel free to call or write me at any time.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Ricia Gomez. I work with Kiana at Leverage Assessments, where I oversee all of our client projects. I got my master's in IO in Miami, Florida. Once I graduated my master's, I started working with law enforcement in Broward and Miami-Dade County, developing their entry-level and promotional assessments. And I had firsthand experience in understanding how my background and my cultural sensibilities added value to some of those processes that I spearheaded. I have an international relations, I guess, perspective when applying my IO in everything that I do. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the great discussions that we're going to have.
Awesome, and thank you for joining us. So we have a couple of questions that we thought would be pertinent to today's discussion, and you'll see them flashing about on Punny's screen. I also wanted to just make a remark, Joel, since you made the point about similarities across cultures, about how, just diverse this group is, right? And it speaks to race. I think of race in America as being really more of a caste system. And we think of it as race classifications, but really it's the social structure that keeps a subordinate class right there to generate wealth, to generate revenue for a power class. And we see those structures in all different countries across the world. So this segues into our first question, right? About important insights in race in contemporary North American society that IO psychology should grapple with while addressing racism in organizations. And you'll see some polls flashing up on the screen as we have this discussion. So please do respond to those polls because they're time limited and they'll come off the screen before you get a chance to click on them. But I know, Rissi, I know that you had some insights on, race and IO psych, and what are some of your thoughts?
When it comes to race and IO psychology, my insights are at times the bias lies in the data that we don't have. So the bias it lies in the candidates that weren't selected, the voices that weren't heard. Based on my experience with law enforcement and developing their assessments, I think it's important to include all perspectives. And as IOs, we've been trained to compose these representative SME samples, right? Or these panels to rely on the establishment of content validity in developing these assessments. And we are also trained to capture the perspective of the job incumbent and the supervisor, right? But I think something that we've been missing was this perspective of the community person, the person who belongs to the community. I've always had a perspective, especially in law enforcement. There's this contention between what's policy and what's practice, right? What's department policy or state ordinance versus what's practice. So that's where you capture the perspective of the supervisor, because he would indicate what's policy as an SME. And then you would capture the perspective of a job incumbent, because that, for example, if that's a patrol officer, they would give you the perspective of what's practice on the. But what about the perspective of the community member, who gives you what's practice in their community when there's exceptions, when things aren't, when it's behind the scenes and it doesn't come from the view of the police officer? I think that's another very important perspective to capture. So I think the community member should be included as an SME in the content development of not just exams, but even in the job analysis process. Because that perspective, they bring a very unique perspective of the tasks that are actually done within law.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. And that gets into, having community members or representation, not just be feeding some other consultant, but be the consultants that are actually doing the job analysis, right? And doing the work that comes behind the implementation of police reform.
Right. I mean, right? I've seen police departments include community members for instance, on assessor panels,
Mhm.
but that's after the fact. That's after
Right.
everything is said and done and developed. Now they're coming in to evaluate performance. You know, I think they need to be included much earlier on because, you know, because the police officer is, like I mentioned many times before, he's closely aligned to his community. Everything that happens, every kidnapping, domestic incident, everything that happens within that community, the police officer is closely aligned to that. So like every problem in my life, public life, it's the police officer's job.
Mhm. Mhm.
So of course, the community member would, you know, should be a stakeholder in the tasks and how things are actually done when they respond to calls for service, right?
Right. And I think that, you know, as a part of that multi-stakeholder approach, our police officers are a part of that community as well. And I think that Black police officers have a unique perspective as well. Craig, I know that you shared some perspectives about, you know, your experience being recruited and selected into the department that were unique to being a Black minority being recruited into a mostly white department, right?
Yeah, yes. A lot of people, a lot of minorities, include me, have little to no interest in becoming police officers. Again, I was not raised in an urban area. I was raised in a suburban area in the South. Never really was afraid of police officers, but you know, never also got the impression that they were friendly. And Rasia makes a good point that historically the police have been compartmentalized from the community and vice versa. There's not a lot of interaction, not a lot of exchange of information. So the police and the communities they represent are all one and the same, but they're almost strangers. So community members don't understand what police officers do, and police officers don't necessarily understand what the community wants. But and I say I was that person until I had some interaction with police officers. I worked in a grocery store where some of the plainclothes officers ended up arresting people multiple times for boosting professional shoplifters. So that piqued my interest a little bit, but then I met an African-American police officer at the College of William and Mary, who was he's a new police officer there. His name is Kenneth Love. And he asked me for directions one day to a building. And I thought that was kind of off-putting, kind of strange because, yeah, he was human.
All of a sudden.
And so over the next couple of years, I think I probably met him my sophomore year. So over the next couple of years, small campus, as I ran into him, I'd chat with him, you know, nothing earth shattering, but talk to them just like I would, you know, the person in the grocery store or my neighbor. So it really humanized police work for me and officers. And so I applied to the police department. And the other hurdle a lot of times to getting in the police department, we had 1,300 applicants for 30 positions, is knowing someone. Luckily for me, I stopped by my high school at some point and talked to the school principal, as I did often after graduating from high school, and told him I'd apply to be a police officer. And he ate lunch with the lieutenant in charge of recruiting every day. So that helped, I'm sure, my process along. And once I got to the police academy, out of 33 recruits in a 29-week academy, I think there was one white female and two African-American males, and the other African-American male and one Korean male, and the other African-American male left about week 7 or 8. He was homesick. His family wasn't in Virginia. They were still in Florida. So I was the only African-American. And it's very interesting in that atmosphere. I had some good experiences talking to one of my future shift mates as a sergeant and as a patrol officer about the fact that he was from Vermont and never really knew any Black people. And, you know, some honest conversations that we still live in the early to mid 90s. And even now, it's somewhat of a segregated society. And that open exchange was helpful for both of us. And I had some bad experiences when a lieutenant who was in charge of our physical training program at one point on the run yelled at the white female in our class that she needed to catch up with the group because it wasn't a good neighborhood for a white girl to be in. So, you know, I had the wide range of experiences, but enjoyed the training. But at some points, you know, particularly in dealing with the lieutenant and some of the things that he said, felt like it was on an island, because at the time in a police department of almost 600 officers, we had 2 Black sergeants. That was it. No command sergeants, no lieutenants, no captains, no majors. It was predominantly white, predominantly male. And that does not lend itself in any organization when you don't have someone to identify with or mentor you, does not lend itself to development or growth or aid the retention of African-American police officers.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and to your point about segregation, you know, I think that, you know, when we talk about insights in North America, I think that a lot of people don't realize that we probably are either as segregated or maybe even more so segregated than we were in the 1950s. You know, I've heard a saying that the 10 a.m. hour on Sunday is the most segregated hour in the U.S. Right? We all go to our individual churches, and that those patterns don't change much, even when we go about our lives throughout the week, and that can heavily impact our interactions, particularly high stakes interactions, like interactions when you're in trouble or interactions with police.
Yeah, it's very impactful, and it really has an impact because, again, you're dealing with strangers. People don't understand each other's culture, and the you know, a lot of times the citizens and the police don't have the idea, and a lot of police departments don't call the citizens anymore because everybody's a member of the community. But there is that division and that lack of understanding that makes stressful situations even more stressful and does not lead to change and growth. One of the things I find really interesting is after the events of last summer, a lot of local county governments, city governments are talking about getting rid of school resource officers. Well, personally, I think school resource officers are a great resource. One, with the school shootings we have in the country, hopefully keep the schools safe, but it's also a great opportunity to introduce people of, you know, African Americans, other communities to police officers and get to know police officers and to have a positive impact on the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like those conversations were a part of, you know, we've had a lot of conversations this summer about either defunding police or abolishing police. You know, I think that a lot of cities are going about experimenting with different ways to do policing, right? Brooklyn had the experiment where they sent out a team of community members to respond to 911 calls. Maryland actually just got rid of the Officers' Bill of Rights. So I think that along with these conversations, there are lots of different ideas flying around, but it's important for us to be included in these conversations. So I'm glad that you were there to say, or that you're here to say, you know, why that's not a good idea, because on the back end of it, right, when we get into, I think that many departments are struggling with two primary goals right now. One is diversifying police departments, so getting more Black law enforcement officers. And two is reducing incidents of use of force, right? Black folks during police interactions, as the data currently shows, have a higher risk of death during those interactions. So those are the two problems that we're struggling with. And if we're getting rid of touch points where you can have a non-stressful and relaxed interaction or introduction to a police officer, that's also going to impact your ability to recruit Black candidates, right?
I think you really hit the nail on the head. And while we don't have all the data yet, the most recent shooting in Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, appears to be, again, on the surface, a huge training error. And I don't mean to make light of it because someone died, but an officer reaching for a taser, and based on her verbalization after shooting this young man, does not appear that she intended to shoot him with a firearm. That's a training issue. So if we defund the police, then there's less training. So we'll end up with more incidents like this. So that's another reason why we should have these honest conversations and have input from the community, input from law enforcement, so that people understand, you know, defunding the police sounds like a great idea, but if you have less training, if you have lower paid officers, you're not going to be able to attract the best and the brightest, whom we all want policing us. We want intelligent, articulate, educated, complex people, but people forget law enforcement is a job, and people have to support themselves, their families, they have to pay off college loans, and if it's not an attractive job financially, and it never has been a great moneymaker, but it's detrimental to you or your family financially, then you're not going to get the best and the brightest. So you'll end up with more incidents like that.
I absolutely couldn't agree more. I know that a lot of folks are hurting for solutions, but I think that when it comes to the defund police policies, we need to make those cuts with a scalpel and not a hammer, right? We need to look at our budgets and figure out where we can move resources or reallocate resources and not just make large chops, particularly because we also know that in the research, if you overwork, I feel like some departments will be, who are forced to make cuts will overwork existing staff as a result. And we know that that fatigued officers are more likely to make those types of judgment mistakes as well, right?
If you, and I live in the DC area, if you look at the news, one of the big complaints about from the Capitol police officers is they're overworked. And I know when I worked for the Secret Service Uniform Division was overworked, mandatory overtime, canceled days off, and they have a different function than your uniformed police officers in the community. But being overworked in a high stress job does not lead to positive outcomes. And it also adds to problems retaining and attracting qualified candidates.
Absolutely agree. And I know that we have some polls going up about, and we look forward to hearing your responses about formal versus informal interactions that you've had with the community. I know that we are also tracking the time. Punny, I see that you got the second question up on the screen. And what is that? What's the second question that we have in our abstract? What are the limits of science and discipline of IO psychology? So Joel, I know that you had some points about the limits of IO psych.
Yes, thank you. You and I have talked about this a fair amount.
We certainly have.
It's something we've thought about for 35 years, reading literature, looking at various police departments, running Monte Carlo simulations. And the conclusions I've had is that we now hire many police officers who we can expect, based on the psychometrics, to fail on the job. We test.
This is a limit of the science?
Yes. If you look at the validity of police officer exams, based on the Amat meta-analysis, the R is 0.24. 0.24 is a lot better than 0, but it's not much better than 0. So some 50% or more of the hires can be expected to be false positives. And some 90% of the qualified Black candidates are false negatives. That means you have qualified Black candidates who are not selected, and other people who are selected, maybe something under half, maybe something over half, can be expected to fail on the job. We test areas that have a high D that cause severe adverse impact. We ignore test areas that have low or 0 D or negative D that could improve validity. And the promotional process is not much better, maybe no better. And I think the implication is we need to have changes to 4 basic HR systems in order to hire more Black police officers at all levels, and also to improve the job performance of police officers at all levels. We need changes to the hiring, to the promotion, to the performance evaluation, and to the supervision.
Yeah, so there are a ton of improvements that we have to make. And do those improvements speak to limitations of the science or limitations of our imagination, perhaps?
Well, some of it is limitations to the science. I mean, the correlation of 0.24 is very modest, but we also have limitations that we've unfortunately just adopted. we are still presuming that cognitive ability is the most valid predictor.
Right.
Sackett has shown us that G is not the most valid predictor in his research in 2007, 2008. There's some evidence that the validity of G decreases with time. The validity
Can you speak English for us? Hold on a second. I know we got some non-psychometric people on the panel. So you got to. Everybody's not IO.
And some entry-level graduate students, so.
Yeah, so
Speak English for us, Joe. What you talking about?
I'm saying that the tests of cognitive ability are not very good, and as time progresses, they become less good.
Why do you think we got that cognitive ability assessments got to be so popular? I think that it's because of standardization and generalization, which really really speaks more towards organizations that for whom it is easier, right, to standardize assessments. It's easier to standardize and apply assessments to a larger group, and it's also more profitable. And I think that that's how they've become more prolific. But what are your thoughts on why G has become so prolific?
I think that's true. And I think it's also just historic. We started out measuring G. For a long time, we thought that it was impossible to measure personality with any accuracy. And there's some truth to that. Different people with different personalities can do various jobs well. But the research now shows that some personality variables are, in fact, have some validity. And we should be using them as best we can. And also, I think maybe we've been lazy. As Paul Sackett describes his research, he said for many, many years, he couldn't believe that the assessment center had less validity than cognitive ability tests, but that's what the research showed. But nobody had taken the time to look at it systematically until he did in 2017 with some graduate students. And I think we still are suffering from, we've always done it that way. And we also are a little protective as a profession. So testing consultants who serve police departments are never asked and never volunteer how many Black officers are likely to be hired based on their test. Nobody asks them, and they don't volunteer. Well, we need to educate police departments and bring them into the decision-making process and give them the information that they need to make reasonable decisions as to how their tests will be structured.
And maybe also select testing consultants that are from the communities that we intend to serve.
That would be a nice idea, but the bureaucracy works against that. The bureaucracy says, we want the testing consultant to have 10 years of experience doing this. Well, it's hard to have 10 years of experience doing it if you're new to the field. So we have to open things up a little bit and explain why we have to
bring in your subject matter experts. If you can't recruit the consultants that are representative of the community, you bring in the community as part of as the SMEs.
Well, you mentioned recruitment. That is extremely important. If your selection process is just a little better than chance, then the people you recruit are extremely important. So if you, I think the industrial psychologists haven't looked at recruitment much. They leave that to recruiters. And
I think a selection process that's a little bit better than chance is also a limitation of science. I mean, you're essentially saying that they've spent all of that money really for no reason. I mean, it's just a song and dance at that point. You can point your finger and
it absolutely is. But if you have high quality recruits, you'll have better police officers. And psychologists don't usually get involved with recruitment, but we really should. We should find out where we should go. I know you had some interesting ideas about where to go to find better recruits.
Well, we talked a little bit about, I mean, that gets into there was also some calls and just in some of the stuff that we were looking at from different communities, Many of the communities also wanted demilitarization of the police. So in that, we were brainstorming about different recruitment pools. We talked about recruiting from schools of psychology. We talked about recruiting psychologists, right? Because 90% of the calls that police officers respond to are nonviolent. And so maybe these people just need resources. We talked about putting social workers out on some of these calls and maybe having different types of response teams.
The interesting thing, the interesting thing about the testing or recruitment is that people also don't realize as a government agency, subjective tests are scary a lot of times. People want objective multiple choice tests because they think it limits the ability of people to sue because everybody's given the same test. And it's also difficult. I work for a small organization. We have panels where we hire people. So we may interview 6 or 7 people for one opening, but we have the time to do that because we have 12 people in our office. But you talk about extrapolating that to, as I said before, my old police department. Are you going to be able to bring in 150 people for panel interviews to get 33 applicants? The panel interviews do address some more complex issues. You get to talk to people. You get to ask situational questions. You get to do things that the IO psychologist would have a lot more input on. That Joel would be able to, you all would be able to shape questions that tested for what was desirable for a police department, but that's hard to do because then you also have to pay a lot of money for someone to design those tests, someone other than police officers.
And you and I, Craig, have talked about the selection process for promotion. And what's usually done now is that applicants are given a 1,500 pages of SOPs to memorize, and they sit on it. And as you pointed out, that's not a good way for people to learn how to be supervisors and learn how to be managers. There are no training programs or limited training programs. And there's considerable potential for improving diversity in performance if we were to train people for the higher level jobs.
Yeah, Joel, you and I had a great discussion about that because I said prior to becoming a sergeant, I worked in traffic safety. But before that, I worked in R&D, research and development, and I actually wrote that manual. So the first hurdle in becoming a sergeant was to be one of the top 40 scorers on that test. And it was a multiple choice test basically based on memorization. Now, there was a panel interview with local police sergeants from other organizations, but the first cut was memorization, which is great. As a sergeant, you should know all of the policy. You should be able to reference all of the policy. That's very necessary, especially in an emergency. But there are some policies you can just look up. I mean, you don't need to memorize things, and you all are psychologists, you know better than I do. Being able to memorize something does not make you a great leader of men and women.
That's right. And I think that that's a great cue for us to get into the solutions, right? Because we talked about all the different problems that police agencies have. We talked about the limits of the science, but what are some of the solutions that we can offer? Craig, that segues you into one of the solutions that we talked about, which was special assignments and how special assignments are so critical for promotions and how that can actually also contribute to the disparity of Black officers being promoted, right? Is that you have to be selected for a special assignment.
So there's, based on opportunity, implicit bias, whatever you want to call it, in both of the majority of my police career, law enforcement career, I got promoted from traffic safety. I was a reconstructionist. I was on the crash team. I reconstructed traffic fatalities. Most of the new sergeants came from specialized positions and went back to uniform operations. Well, you have to apply for and compete for those specialized positions. So having that opportunity to get to that specialized position opens the door to promotion. Very much the same when I worked for the Secret Service. People generally needed to check the proverbial box on protection or investigations, but particularly on protection on the vice president's detail and the president's detail. You needed to go out and do, conduct certain number of advances, foreign advances, be not just the site agent doing the site advance for the president or vice president, but the lead agent who was in charge of all of the advance team. again, a supervisor and someone in our ops section had to, bless you, for lack of a better word, to get those great assignments, because you put that on your brag sheet. That was what was used to build your internal resume. So you could look at two agents and say, well, this one agent's great because they've done all of these great things. Well, they've done all of these great things because maybe they're buddies, maybe they're drinking buddies with their supervisor who gives them those great assignments. So they were labeled as, competent or great, but that opportunity has to come. And, we've all talked about, Joel, you talked about training before becoming a supervisor. We talked about mentorship. So yes, those opportunities to be mentored, to have, we literally at the Secret Service, they literally would refer to a supervisor who looked out for you as a rabbi. They'd say, hey, this person has a rabbi who takes care of them, who, gives them the great assignments, who's going to make the phone calls to get them where they need to go. Well, that's not very objective. That's not based on, not necessarily based on your ability. It's based on who you know and
Right.
who likes you.
Right.
And in police work, uniform police work, that's really not a good indication of how you're going to handle stressful situations, how well you're going to manage your officers who are out handling stressful situations.
Absolutely. And I know that we talked about a bunch of other solutions that IOs could offer. Rissy, I remember talking about how, IOs can help not only do the job analysis, but look at incidents to fill other skills gaps and maybe figure out which other types of professionals could co-respond to calls along with police officers to add another level of expertise, which can hopefully help de-escalate calls.
And then including maybe social workers to take some of those calls. Right. And that's where, if we're looking to re-engineer the role of an officer, it's like redoing the job analysis, and we come back to like the needs of the community. And law enforcement or policing in general, we have to take a very qualitative approach. And I think, I won't say that's the limit of our science, but we're very objective driven, right? Of course, we are able to transform like these qualitative SME input into quantitative data. But I think we still have to, when it comes to policing, we have to stick with a very qualitative approach. Why? Because every community is different. And I know it was mentioned that, off-the-shelf assessments are more objective, so they're more relied on, they're more legally defensible. And that's fine. It's just ensuring that these assessments are meeting the needs of the community, right? They provide the data, the norm data that reflect the community in which they're being used upon. So yes, it's important to consider re-engineering the role of police officer because it's dynamic. It changes with, the shifts in demographics, cultural, technological, socioeconomic factors of the community. The role of the of the police officer changes. So yeah, we want to look to different skills like softer skills, right? Social working skills and whatever. But I think in order to look at those skills, we have to put on our qualitative lens to see how those skills change across communities. Because the demands of an officer would change from each police department.
Absolutely. And I think also, we think of police officer roles as sort of being fairly stagnant, but I think that we don't give them as much credit for their roles changing along really with every budget cycle, right? Every time you make a cut to a different agency, whether it's the Department of Homeless Services or whether it's, shutting down mental health institutions, that is going to impact your police officers and the kind of calls that they're going to be responding to and the kind of work that they're going to be doing. And maybe it's about shortening that job analysis time so that we are honoring the fact that their roles are changing and are dynamic, and that we should make sure that that's reflected in their job description and job analysis. And Pani, I know that you had some other thoughts on some of the solutions as well.
Yes, as a professor teaching young students leadership skills, I would like to invite your group to participate in our work integrated learning project, where our students will listen to subject matter experts and hopefully, get a real perspective and understanding of what does it mean to be a police officer, and then really design a training program around that. So that's the fruit of all our discussions this past year.
Oh, wow.
So proud that my students will be able to help in this cause. What can educators of IO psychology do? That's something that we can bring to the classroom, and that's what I would like to encourage our audience to stick around and participate in the chat. And also, we have 7 minutes left. So we would really like to open this up for other ideas. Please turn on your mic or your video and we could have a lively conversation. And thank you so much for all the wonderful ideas we've heard. So we're going to open it up for discussion.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions from the audience? I saw a message in the chat that asked about, whether anti-racism contributes, or whether principles of anti-racism can contribute to diversifying police agencies. What are your thoughts, guys?
Well,
and the cut.
I'm just making these up.
No, but this went great. So we have exactly 7 minutes left.
Mhm.
We started a little bit after 4.
Mhm.
And, we have plenty of time. And I think the only part where,
but from a strictly law enforcement standpoint,
Notice how relaxed and how it's flowing now that y'all have stopped the recording. But go ahead. Now the conversation's getting good. Go ahead.
it's not a
recording this,
there's no complex discussion about that whole incident. Again, from just seeing her reaction to that, again, she killed somebody, which you can't do, but seeing her reaction to that, people are marching, and I get it's people, the citizens, like, figure out why she shot that guy. That and George Floyd are completely separate incidents. Obviously, the results are still tragic. They're still the same, but figure out how to fix that. And I understand there's emotion, there's anger. I was angry. I'm emotional.
Right. Well, and I think that this gets into having expertise from the community. It's that intersectionality, because you have a lot of anger, you have a lot of emotions, but you also have to have folks like us who have the expertise to come in and break down, okay, what happened at that incident,
and focus on it. Because you see Derek Chauvin, I see, evil, like he's just smiling and thinks this thing's funny, and he kills a guy, and it takes 9 minutes to do it. You see her shoot a guy and basically say, "Oh shit, I just used my gun." I mean, that was, unless she's a Academy Award winning actress, that was a very visceral, very real reaction to something she clearly didn't intend to do. So you need to, like, Breonna Taylor is not Derek Chauvin, is not Brooklyn. Like, we need to bring in the community, bring in the IO psychologists, bring in law enforcement, and discuss, okay, what is this thing that happened? Why did this thing happen? And going forward, how do we stop this thing from happening? Is this implicit bias? Is this a training error? What are the factors that fed this thing? And how do we not have it ever happen again in our community? Because, as somebody, the Racia brought it up, every law enforcement organization is different. Like, Kiana, you're from New York City. I'm from the suburbs of Richmond, and now the suburbs of DC. My law enforcement organization that I work for and that polices my area is completely different from yours. And because I've been in New York.
Yeah. And I feel like that's something I also want to express to because there's going to be a lot of majority Caucasian IO psychologists watching us.
There'll be a lot of white people on the call.
And I feel like that's something that I want to say, in that as IOs, if you're consultants working with police, remember culture is a huge factor.
This is your moment, girl.
Of your assessments in everything that you do. So if you are Caucasian working on an assessment or working with a police department that's, within a marginalized Black African American community, do as much work and research and bring as much SMEs from that community as possible in the development of your assessments.
Say it.
So you can work with that, but you need to understand the culture in which these people live and the culture in which this police department operates. It's it's very different from yours.
Yes.
Well, the other thing, Rasia, too, and you also need to realize, because we're trying to bridge the gap here,
Not
you need to
Rashida
realize
got rid
the
of them
culture.
polls.
You need to realize the culture of the police organization. Because every police organization has a different culture.
Right.
So, you know, the police department I came from, and I'll say this, I thought was way more professional than NYPD. When I went to New York, you know, when I used to go to New York every fall for the UN General Assembly, I would look at the New York police officers and say, I mean, the way they dress, the way they behave, some of it I found off-putting. I found unprofessional, you know, beneath me, if you would. Call me an elitist. But I thought to myself, I would never behave like that in my police organization. And I had an interaction, and a great story. I had an interaction with NYPD officers as I was driving a vehicle back to park it on the street for a small detail. I was on a small detail to lead for, I think it's the First Lady of Mauritania, a small African country. And I was on a cell phone. You're not supposed to be on a cell phone driving in New York City. And I had a New York police officer walk up to the car and use quite a bit of profanity to tell me to get off the phone. Mm. I found that interesting from a number of facts. One, I was an African-American male. Two, I was wearing a suit. And three, he and his partner, I assume, did not see the firearm I was carrying on my hip. And I got really angry, called one of my buddies who's a former negotiator, and it was a Secret Service agent. And because the incident happened in front of the hotel where I was staying, and I had to park the car some blocks off and then walk back to my hotel. And my buddy talked me off the ledge, because I said, when I got back to the hotel, if they were standing in front of my hotel, we were going to have some choice words.
Yeah, I think IOs need to do a better job. And then for IOs who don't work for police departments, I would advocate that they do
ride-along.
They do these ride-alongs, as well as these public record requests. Like within your own community, reach out to your police department, find out who's designing the assessments, what were the consultants that, you know, awarded contracts, what were the SME panels that they use, the assessor panels that they use. We're IO psychologists, we know what questions to ask. And those
read the news.
Read the news, you know, exactly, like get engaged. I mean, you know, these public records requests, they're on file, and they bring accountability to who's ever in that position. And transparency drives accountability. Accountability drives change. And that's what we're trying to do, engender change. So, yeah.
Rasia, that's perfect. I was asked to consult with another group for a law enforcement agency. And one of the first things I'd ended the consultants who were not law enforcement said, hey, look at the local news so you understand what's going on. And I looked at the public internet. I looked at the website. I looked at the command staff. I looked at their
talk to some people,
their age,
some of the meetings,
their years of service, their educational background, and then looked at the news and came up with an opinion. Now, Craig's opinion, but that community completely different from a lot of other communities, and a history of racial incidents involving law enforcement officers, internal incidents amongst officers in the news constantly.
Right.
So this is the conversation that I need y'all to have while the damn session is happening.